He's a military veteran and a first-term state rep who wants to go from representing Nashua in Concord to serving New Hampshire's 2nd Congressional District in Washington. Steve Negron is our guest this morning. Representative, thanks for being here.
Good morning, Adam. Thank you for having me.
So for a lot of people, this is a first impression, not just in the 2nd District, but beyond. So who is Representative Steve Negron?
Steve Negron has been a public servant his entire life. I'm retired military. I've been in the military, associated with the military since my time at ROTC since 1979. My father was military. We grew up in a military home, and it's just an environment that I'm just used to about serving the people.
So right now in Washington, so much is about how people define themselves in relation to the president.
Right.
As a Republican in Congress, if elected, would you be a Trump Republican or more of a skeptic?
Well, you know, people have asked me that question, and what I tell people is that when I took my oath of office as a commissioned officer, I raised my right hand and took an oath to defend the Constitution of the United States. That same Constitution provides a framework for the presidency of this United States. I will always show deference to the presidency of the United States and to the office. I may not always agree with presidents that have been there. I may not always agree with President Trump on everything, but I've always had that same position on previous presidents. So my loyalty as a representative is to that office which the Constitution provides.
What are some things or some points of disagreement there with the president?
Well, I think it's a lot that a lot of people have talked about. I think is we're new and we're being exposed to a lot of the way he deals with the media, right? And I think it's a transition, and I think it's something that a lot of people are a little uncomfortable with. It isn't necessarily, I think, of the message that he has. We've come a long way from the time that we'd see Cronkite on television, right? And they would be the sole reason and the sole purpose of how we got our news. It's a little different today. We have a very dynamic world out there today, and he's using that to his benefit. And I think that's some of the problems that we're having.
Some dissonance there for folks. But
sure.
You served in the Air Force. We see the president kind of at odds again with yet another Gold Star family. Let's set aside the fact that what he may have said or not said to them is in dispute. The fact that he's engaged in this again for another time, is that troubling at all to you?
Well, I think first of all is that we have to honor and respect all those soldiers and sailors and airmen and Marines that go off in harm's way. And for those who aren't fortunate enough to come back, we owe them a debt of gratitude, not only to them, but to their families. And people forget that when a soldier, sailor, airman, or Marine goes off, the family is part of that too. And so I think part of what he has to do as a president, as a commander-in-chief, is to make sure that those young men and women that do go off know that they got somebody back in Washington that's watching their back. I don't know all the particular details of what that was, but certainly the commanders and certainly the Secretary of Defense, who himself is a retired 4-star Marine Corps general, knows what it is about making sure that the families are taken care of and that we reach out to them. So I don't have anything specific to talk about, but I know that at least they have to be able to reach out to the families.
If you're in Congress, what are we going to know you for? What's going to be your signature issue?
A lot of things is that I'm not a shrinking violet. And I've shown that in the State House, especially with the budget. I was one of those 66 representatives that in social media we were labeled as political terrorists because we didn't go along with the party line. I think my own mind. But as a representative of the great state of New Hampshire, I'm the voice of the people. I'm the voice of New Hampshire. And those are the kind of things that I think that people need to know about me, is that if I am elected and you send me to Washington, I'm just a temporary employee. That's all I am. It's not my seat, it's your seat. And so I will make sure that I speak on behalf of those people that sent me to Washington.
And so that the quote-unquote political terrorists, that's the epithet that we'd use against the Freedom Caucus, essentially. Would we see you transition from the Freedom Caucus in Concord to the Freedom Caucus down in D.C.?
Absolutely. And I think that there isn't a one-size-fits-all. And I think you have to be able to get to the table and actually then legislate and actually then discuss and find out what's the best way. It's funny, during the general election last year in Nashua in Ward 5, I had a beautiful little 13-year-old come up to me and she asked her mother if she could ask me a question. And she came up to me and she goes, "Are you a Republican or a Democrat?" And I said, "Well, I'm a registered Republican." But it doesn't mean I have all the answers. There are smart people on both sides of the aisle. And what we need to do is when you have two smart people come up with a singular answer, it's better for everybody. And she looked at me and she goes, "You mean we don't do that?" I said, "Not as much as we should." So absolutely is being able to do those kind of things is what's important for a legislator.
One issue we were seeing some consensus on within just the last few weeks was this the bump stock that came to light, or was more people gained awareness of it after the mass shooting in Las Vegas. We saw that sort of groundswell a little bit towards maybe we'll regulate or ban, but now that's kind of backed off a little bit. Do you think that those accessories that essentially allow a rifle to fire more rapidly, should those be widely available and legal in the United States?
Well, I think the real question is that why are we having these events happening, right? What is the situation that bring people to do those sort of things? And it isn't necessarily the tool or the mechanism that they use. I think it's a bigger, broader issue. I think is why does an individual feel that's how he voices his discontent. That issue of the stock is really one that is a larger issue than just what happened in Vegas. So a lot of times we're reactionary, and a lot of times we're rushed to judgment. I think we need to take a step back, realize, A, that is something that is not going to be tolerated in this country, and what is it that we have to do both from a mental state capacity, from, you know, as a citizen, what do we do to need to protect them? So I think that you need to take a step back, take a deep breath, pray for those victims that happened in Las Vegas and for their families, and to figure out what's the right way to go forward.
If we're going to do something about mental health, though, to sort of trying to get at this darkness, whatever it is that's motivating these individuals to wreak this havoc and violence on people's lives, that's going to cost money. That would be a federal program, perhaps, that would bring back sort of a larger bureaucracy dealing with mental health. Is that something that's okay with you if we are going to stop that?
Well, certainly as a state Republican, I'm not for growing the government. And I believe that there's a lot of situations out there that their neighbors, friends, families, co-workers need to take a more involved action. It's come to that point that before we just walk away and say, oh, he's just or she's just, you know, somebody that's, you know, a little off center. Now we're looking at those kind of things, and I think it's a fabric that's being out there in our country that there's a lot of discontent for a lot of different reasons, and these are how some of the people are responding to that. We need to try to help those people first and try to figure out what's a way to make sure that they get all the help that they need.
What should Congress be doing right now about the DACA recipients, the so-called dreamers who are here, essentially arrived in this country as children but do not have citizenship? Sure.
Well, my grandfather came over from Mexico, from a city, a town, country, actually a state called Michoacan, into New York City. So I'm very close to this, and my father's from Puerto Rico. Even though we're U.S. citizens, there's a lot of feeling that's out there. DACA is, and we've talked about this often, there are laws in place, right? A child that's born here that has been a productive citizen, goes to school and stuff, we need to look at those people a little differently, right? It wasn't their fault that they came over here and were born here. So we need to look at that. To make a sweeping statement that everybody is swept up and everybody needs to go away, I think is a little bit irrational. I think we need to take a step back, take a look at what really is the intent of what we're trying to do here, and make sure that those people that really had it wasn't their fault that they were born here, and they're just as a productive citizen as I am or you are, then we need to make sure that we protect those and not just make these generalizations and just say we're going to send everybody home.
You mentioned ties to Puerto Rico there.
Yes.
Do you still have family down there?
Absolutely.
What's going on right now? Have you heard?
Well, it's really funny. One of the things that we saw in national news is that there wasn't a lot of help there, but there was a trucker strike that was in Puerto Rico that didn't get a lot of fanfare. So there was a union there, and there was a disagreement with the governor. And so when the hurricane hit, there was still some bad blood that was out there, right? So it's very hard. Puerto Rico's not a big island; it's 100 by 35, and the infrastructure out there took a beating. And I talked to my aunt and my cousins, and thank God they're fine. But it's a resilient island. The people from Puerto Rico are very resilient. As long as we have our music playing, I mean, we can play our dominoes, we're going to be fine.
You're from Nashua.
Yes, sir.
If you're in Congress, would you be advocating for federal funding for commuter rail?
Oh, that's kind of a touchy subject, right? So I think right now, in light of what, and kudos to our governor about putting a prop forward to look at Amazon, I think that changes the dynamic of the discussion, especially if New Hampshire is able to get, and Londonderry is the site that's being proposed, if they were able to get that Amazon here. So I think that would change the complete dynamic of it. I think the issue of rail for me in Nashua is, I think it's a good thing, but I think you need to be cautious going forward. It's not the golden ticket necessarily, because a lot of people have talked to me and said, if I bring a rail, then is that a possibility of having even more people leave Nashua to go south? You have to put an infrastructure in place. You have to put those kinds of hooks so that people would want to come up to Nashua. I adopted New Hampshire as a state, right? Being a military guy, I was a nomad. I was a transient. And in '89, I came here and I fell in love with this state. It's the quintessential state of where you wanted to raise a family. My wife and I raised 3 beautiful children here in New Hampshire. So I think rail could be a possibility, but you can't just go in, close eyes. You have to look at all the potential ramifications.
Circling back to Concord, before we start talking too much about Washington, you're going to have a vote coming up, potentially, if Speaker Jasper is nominated and appointed as the Department of Agriculture's commissioner, for a new speaker.
Yes, sir.
This is early, but who would you like to see in that job?
Well, I think everybody that's actually called me and we've gotten letters are all qualified. And so I think we have to listen to them, let them vet. We actually have, in November, we're going to be talking both as a caucus, both the Democratic caucus and the Republican caucus. And I think I'm going to wait until we start hearing what some of those issues are. You hear some people say that I'm not going to run for a follow-on term if I'm elected in the interim. That's a good data point. But what we have to do is whoever does come into that point is got to make sure that the Republican caucus is solid going forward. We've done some great things in the House this session, and we need to continue that momentum.
And quickly here, if you do end up in Washington and you're a member of the Freedom Caucus, would you be supporting Paul Ryan for Speaker again, or would you want something more conservative?
I like Congressman Ryan. I like his stance on taxes. I think that he's doing some great things. Because I don't know a lot of what their basis was and why they promoted, because I wasn't privy to the information, I'd have to listen to all potential candidates and then make an informed decision at that point.
All right. Representative Steve Negron from Nashua,
Adam, thank
running
you so
for
much.
Congress in CD2. Thanks for being here today.
You're welcome. Thank you.
We'll see you out on the trail.